There are certain things in life that we just have to learn the fundamentals. There's no shortcuts. There's no easy way around it. You have to learn the fundamentals. And when we try taking shortcuts or the easy path, well, usually it ends up biting us in the end, and usually it's in the rear end. For example, we all want to get rich quick. All right, well, look at lottery winners. They usually, after a few years after hitting the lottery, they're usually flat broke. Well, that's because they never learned the fundamentals of managing money to start with. They took the shortcut, and it ended up catching up with them. Well, hunting's no exception. There's just certain fundamentals that we just have to put in the work and learn. A great example is shooting. There's basic fundamentals of shooting, and I don't care how much you spend on a new rifle and scope. If your shooting fundamentals are horrible, it's probably going to end up, getting you in the end. Well, the wind's one of those fundamentals of hunting that we really need to understand, and it's generally the least talked about fundamental. And it's, as with all fundamentals, understanding the wind is work. And you're starting to work on that one right now. Because if you make it through this boring video, it's going to be work. It's going to require some effort. And I'm sorry, but there's just no way I could make this one exciting. It's the wind. I mean, I can't even show it to you on a video. We can't even see it. Maybe that's why, most people don't talk about it that much. You can't see it. It isn't exciting. It is boring. But it is worth understanding, and it'll make a big difference in your hunting. But before we jump into that, I need to explain exactly why. And then you'll understand here in just a moment, I promise, why I needed to go here. Hunting is not complicated. We go hunting, and either we get an animal or we don't. That's why it's called hunting and not shooting. But there are certain fundamentals that tend to help us. Now, we don't have to know any of those fundamentals to go out hunting and get a game animal. We don't have to be able to shoot very well with a rifle. Seriously, you can be a poor shot and still be successful and get an animal. But if you're an extremely good shot, every once in a while, you're going to get an opportunity that not just anybody would get. You'll be able to take an animal that not just anybody would have been able to make the shot, or a lot of people wouldn't have even tried. Okay, so it's going to help you once in a while. Scouting. You can go to a brand new spot you've never hunted before in your life and take a game animal. But if you've gone scouting and you understand the area, well, every now and then that's going to give you an edge, and it's going to give you more opportunities that somebody else that hasn't scouted the area, they might not be able to capitalize on. And then the same way with the wind. You don't have to pay the wind a bit of attention. You can go hunting and take game. But every once in a while, it's going to make the difference. Well, that's the thing about the fundamentals on hunting. When you get really good with those fundamentals, it gives you extra opportunities here and there. You're not going to be just light years ahead of somebody that doesn't know the fundamentals, but you're going to get an extra opportunity here and there. And over the course of a season, all of those extra opportunities are going to add up, and that's the difference between a great hunting season or just a mediocre or a poor hunting season. And in the case of the wind, you really need to understand those other fundamentals with wind, because if you don't, then understanding wind itself is pretty much meaningless, which is why I think so many don't pay attention to the wind, because if you're not good with the other fundamentals, well, you don't need to know anything about the wind. Now I'm going to bring up a satellite photo so I can explain some of this. You can see there's an area that was clear cut, and it's grown up, and it's pretty thick in there now. And we have an access road that runs beside it and around the back side. Well, the first time I scouted this place, which was well before season started, I noticed does were bedding in this little area right here, And I noticed the tracks of a really nice buck coming straight through here and into the clear cut. So I had an idea of what was going on in this area. Well, the first time I went to actually hunt it, the wind was blowing out of the southwest, even though it was supposed to be blowing out of the northeast. Well, that wasn't going to work. I would have had scent blowing all over the place going in, and my scent would have blown straight to the doe's bedding area. So rather than going in and having my scent blown all over the area and spooking deer, I hunted the entrance and I didn't see a thing. So I waited until I had a steady northeast wind before I went back. And then I went to that back corner I wanted to hunt. It was a morning hunt, and I didn't see a thing then either. Well, then I waited until we had another steady northeast wind, except for this time I went back in the evening. And my friend Joey hadn't hunted any that year. He wanted to go, so I put him on this corner, and I went on down. He got that big buck. It took 3 hunts to get that deer, and it was on heavily pressured public land. Had I not understood what was going on in that area and just went in there on the first day with the wrong wind, I would have pretty much blown out that area. So it wasn't just understanding the wind, but putting that together with the other fundamentals like scouting. Now I know that's pretty simple textbook stuff there. So, really basic. But seriously, how many of you on that first day, opening day, you're all excited, can't wait to get to the tree, you got picked out, and the wind's blowing the wrong direction? How many of you would have stopped right there and just hunted at the gate like I did? Come on now, be honest. All right. That's where understanding the fundamentals and wind comes in. I did it, and it paid off 2 hunts later. All right, so now let's talk about the wind and the 2 different types. For the 2 wind types, there's the prevailing wind and then there's thermoclines. And the prevailing wind, well, that's generally simple enough sometimes. When the weatherman says the wind's going to be blowing northeast, what he's saying is it's going to be blowing out of the northeast and blowing to the southwest. And it sometimes does what he says it's going to do. It's a weather forecast. You know how that goes. What I'll do is on my phone, I've got an app. I use Weather Underground. There's a lot of different weather apps. But I'll pull up the wind so that I can see by the hour what they're predicting. And generally, that's pretty close for the prevailing wind. It's not 100%. But if you see that over the course of the day, there's going to be a lot of changes in wind direction. All right, well, that means the atmosphere is not stable, and there's no telling what the wind's going to do that day. That's just part of it. You need to be prepared for it. It could change directions every 5 minutes. And if you've got a front coming through, and that's generally when you see that, when you've got a front coming through, and think, the atmosphere is just not stable, that's generally when you get all those changes. Okay. But on a normal, just stable day, it's usually pretty consistent. All right, now let's talk about thermoclines. A lot of us have heard about thermoclines as far as hunting out west. I mean, it's pretty well known out there in the mountains and so forth. And basically what happens is at night, the valleys get cold. Cold air sinks. As that cold air is sinking in the valleys, it's pulling air down the mountain, down the slopes. So you end up with a breeze that's flowing down the slopes of the mountains. Okay. Well, then the sun comes up, and it warms up the air in the valleys. That air gets really warm then, and it starts rising. So sometime around mid-morning, afternoon, whatever, depending on the weather and so forth, but sometime you're going to get a change in the wind direction, and the wind's going to start going up the slopes because that wind down low is getting warmer. All right, and that's pretty well understood, and the people that hunt in places with thermoclines, they pretty well know them. All right. Well, myself, I always thought that just applied out west, and that didn't really apply here in the east, especially here in the southeast. But I have since learned it definitely applies here. It just works very differently. All right, so let me bring up another map, and this time this is a topographical map. This is an area that I hunt pretty regularly, and do you notice the elevation changes here where the terrain drops off quickly into the creek valley? Well, here the creek valley is almost always colder, especially early season when the weather's still pretty warm, and that's because the water in the creek is cold, along with all the rocks and so forth in the creek bed. As a result, there's almost always a draft blowing straight down these hills to the creek. So no matter what direction the prevailing wind is blowing, unless it's just really, really blowing hard, and I mean something fierce, a day you wouldn't go hunting on anyway, well, the wind's always going to be blowing down to the creek. And if I go just a few hundred yards to the other side of this ridge, there's another creek doing the exact same thing, and the wind will be blowing the completely opposite direction at the exact same time. It'll be blowing straight down to this creek. That's because of the thermals. And both of these spots are almost impossible to hunt. The first spot, I have tried almost everything, and I just can't get in there. The deer are either bedding and see me come in and start blowing, or when they get up and start moving, they'll travel straight up the ridge. If I set up on top, they smell me because my wind's going straight down to them. If I go in a circle and circle around behind them and then come up, well, I can't come up the ridge but so far before they see me. And if I stop before they see me, well, then they just walk away from me going up the ridge when they do start moving. And it's just tough to set up like that. And I can't set up on an off wind here either because it's just so thick on this particular spot that there's only one place that I can set up, and that's where this funnel is. Well, this funnel, it acts like a funnel for the wind also. And if I set up off to the sides, well, it still just draws the wind into that same spot. For me, this spot is unhuntable. But what I can do is set up on top of the ridge, especially early in the season when they're moving really well in daylight, where the prevailing wind takes over, and I have consistently taken a deer here every year for the past 3 years at least with the muzzleloader and one with the rifle. Every place with a creek and an elevation drop like that, it's not going to set up that same way. It's not necessarily going to have a thermal going down to the creek. But I have seen a lot of other places in my area that also do that. And those other places generally tend to be really hard to hunt also. But just like this spot, at least early in the season, there can be some really good hunting around them. Or if I can find a place where the point going in or slope going into the creek isn't nearly as steep, then there tends to not be near as much of a thermal going to the creek. And those can be some really good spots. So the prevailing wind's pretty consistent. And that helps us out as hunters. For example, if you're trying to figure out where to position a permanent stand, or when you're scouting and figuring out access points. And my area, our two most common winds are either out of the northeast or out of the southwest. And we get other wind directions, of course, but that's our most common by far. So anytime I go scouting, I'm trying to figure out a way to access a particular place, either from the northeast for when we have a southwest wind, or I want to be able to access it out of the southwest when we have a northeast wind. So it makes scouting a lot simpler. At the same time, because those wind directions are pretty consistent, that can also help us as far as game because it's going to consistently position game animals. And a good example of that is where I hunted this morning. Let me pull up another map. So we have another access road going up another ridge. And I set up right here on this small ridge to the side, this little secondary point. The area in front of this is really thick. It was clear cut recently and it's grown up, and you know it's thick, and there's a lot of does bedding in here. All right, if you're a buck and you're gonna want to check these areas out, you're scent checking for those, well, where would you want to walk? Okay, and in here, he's going to be walking right down this side anytime there's a southwest wind. And that way, he can catch their scent if there's a hot doe in there. Or if the thermals kick in because of this creek right here, it's going to pull the scent straight to him. So he's going to parallel this creek anytime we have thermals or southwest wind. And then if we have a northeast wind, he's going to want to cut across the bottom right here. Again, that way he can scent check. He's downwind of any particular hot doe. In this particular spot, we also have a really shallow point right here that there's a shallow grade going down into the creek bottom. Well, that's a perfect access point for him, for a buck to come up out of a creek bottom or go down in it, because deer are just like us. They don't want to climb a steep hill if they don't have to. And in this particular case, where I set up at was right here, and what we had is 3 trails coming together, all from the same deer. And he had rubs and scrapes all over the top of this ridge. And if you'll notice, there's a really sharp drop into a creek bottom right behind where I set up, and we had a northeast wind this morning. So my wind's blowing right off the top of that hill into that bottom, really over that bottom, where the deer aren't there because of that sharp drop. So I don't have to worry about anything coming up behind me. And the thermals also are going to want to pull my scent down in there. So that's the perfect spot right there. And perfect travel corridor for the deer. And again, the signs were there, the trails were there. Unfortunately, I didn't see the buck come through this morning, but there's a nice one hitting it. And eventually, I'm probably going to get him right there. See what I mean about making it through this video being work? It's hitting exciting stuff, but it is important. And hopefully this will get you to really thinking about the wind along with the other fundamentals. And then that's when those opportunities all of a sudden just start popping up every so often. Well, that's the difference between those really good hunters and those that aren't. And the really good ones, they're grinding away just like all of us, especially the ones on public land and some private land for that matter. They're not seeing game animals going and coming all of the time. They're working for it. They just have those fundamentals down, and they're just getting those couple of extra opportunities. And so often in hunting, that's the difference between a successful hunt or an unsuccessful one. Is you zig when you should have zagged. And we've all been there. That's just the way it is. But as you get better with those fundamentals, all of a sudden, every now and then you'll zag when you should have zagged, and it'll work out. And after the course of a season, those opportunities are going to add up. And for myself, I'm still working on understanding the wind better. And what I've learned so far is every place is different. You just have to go in scouting a particular spot and just work hard on understanding how the wind works in that area, whether it's the thermals or even the prevailing wind. The prevailing wind's going to act differently in different areas. It'll get funneled in this spot or maybe this spot. And also learning to predict what the prevailing wind is going to do. And then there's days you're just going to have to look at the forecast and say, it's just too unstable. I'm not going to risk it in this spot. All right, well, that's when you need a backup spot that, you can see a really long ways and make a long shot so you don't have to get too close and spook them. It's about the best I've come up with for those days. At this point, as usual, I have no clue what we're going to do next week. No idea. I did find the rings for that Parker Hale. The Lord was smiling on me on that one. I got lucky. They were on eBay. And I have no idea how long it's going to take them to get here from England. Yeah. But I might actually get to hunt with that rifle before this season's over. So keep your fingers crossed. And as soon as I get those rings, we're going to the range. Hopefully it's soon. And I do want to thank every one of you that did some looking for me as far as trying to find some. I appreciated that. And thankfully I did find something. So, and as far as wind, I think we covered it on the wind. There's probably a lot more we could talk about, but that's the basics. And I want to recommend, for those of you that hadn't seen any of the hunting public videos, they've got some really interesting stuff as far as how deer bed and wind and so forth is worth watching. So do a search on hunting public and bedding deer. And then some of those videos will pop up. It's pretty good stuff. All right, I think that covered it for the wind. God bless and have a good night.